as Don said, today we're going to discuss shared calling. Matt, you want to give a quick 2-second?
Yeah, maybe let's just flip right into. Do we move to the overview slide here, Duane? Did you move us ahead? Maybe move us to the first slide. Yeah, so before we talk about shared calling, we like to just level set, right? Traditional kind of dedicated Teams phone, we have essentially an account. It could be for a user, it could be for a Teams room, it could be for a shared device. Basically, we add that Teams phone license that could come in a number of different license SKUs via E5. Could be a standalone license. It could come with your Teams rooms license. And then we add that PSTN connectivity model, right? Calling plans, operator connect, direct routing. And then we do some simple enablement, right? Enterprise voice equals true. We assign a DID to the user. And then we may assign a number of different policies, Teams policies, to kind of customize that user experience. So that's kind of what this slide shows, right? So Duane, if you can pull us along here, let's talk about how shared calling is essentially different from what many of you may be used to today. So with shared calling, the main benefit here is that we now in Teams support the ability to share a single phone number with up to 10,000 users. And, when we first typically say that, the common question that we receive back is, well, how does that work? If we call the shared number, is it going to ring all of those users simultaneously? The short answer is no. This is not like a call queue. This works more like dial the shared number and you will be prompted, essentially via an auto attendant for a dial by name type experience from an inbound perspective. From an outbound perspective, all the users in the shared calling policy are going to be able to, essentially leverage that single phone number from an outbound calling perspective. So that's how it works at the highest level. And, one of the biggest benefits of this capability is just simplified deployment and reduction of administrative overhead. We can rapidly enable this capability to many users almost within minutes. And
so correct me if I'm wrong, Matt. You just said we could put in 10 people or 10,000 people?
Correct. Highly scalable solution here.
Wow. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, great question. And ultimately, right, the ability for us to do this rapidly helps our customers basically realize the value of their team phone investment much faster than, a traditional long style marathon where, we're going station by station, site by site, business unit by business unit. And we'll talk about kind of, a little bit later on how we can kind of turn that methodology around, is enable Teams phone for all and then kind of have a go back motion to figure out who needs DIDs, right? So it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be all or none, right? It's not all shared calling or all dedicated calling, as I like to call it. It's all about mixing and matching. And this provides a lot more flexibility to administrators, kind of as voice calling needs, for many organizations are changing. We're seeing a lot more Teams meetings, a lot more teams to teams VoIP calling, both internally and externally. So some of those behaviors are kind of, making a solution like this, more feasible.
Awesome.
So we do talk about, right, this feature does support multiple PSTN connectivity models. It is important to call out that when we say it's supported by calling plans, it is supported by pay-as-you-go calling plans. So traditional, 3,000-minute calling plan, 120-minute calling plan is not supported in this model. You do need the specific pay-as-you-go calling plan type. Operator Connect, this is supported, but it is important to validate with your operator that your operator does support this capability, and then it is supported with direct routing.
So sort of a calling on demand flavor?
Exactly. You know, some people do refer to this as Teams Phone on Demand. It's an easy way to enable it for many users at scale who may have light calling needs. So, but at the same point, right, the simplified model, the ability to potentially save costs, it does allow us to provide those basic voice capabilities to users who may not need a DID. But it is fully functional, right? And that's what the last bullet here talks about is you're not going to lose any features when we enable this. It does support dynamic E911, kind of supports an ELIN model, which we'll talk about in one of the next slides. But that's really it. It's not any less functionality wise.
That's exciting. Okay. Fully functional for emergency calling. That's exciting. And we are going to delve into that a little bit in just a few minutes, right?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, if you want to flip us ahead here to the next slide. So yeah, just kind of talking through the benefits. We've already talked about the ability it's quick and easy to enable. We'll show that exactly how to create a Teams phone shared calling policy, how to assign users to it, right? We'll talk about that. Again, getting to that point of realizing value in the license investment you've made with Microsoft, realizing that faster. Modernizing the calling experience, right? If your organization is looking at Copilot or using Copilot today, right, you need Teams Phone to do that. If you've got a legacy voice platform, it's not going to be supported with Copilot. So the versatility, right? The first previous slide, we kind of spoke a little bit more in the context of using this with user accounts, but it also works great with Microsoft Teams rooms or shared devices. So again, it can help you save costs, simplify the deployment. It's risk-free, right? If your organization is highly adopted and with Teams meetings, you can essentially turn this on in parallel to your existing telephony platform with relatively little impact. So we always want to plan accordingly when we're adding voice workloads to the network. But this is essentially a risk-free way to, test the technology if you're not already adopted. From a simplification standpoint, as you move forward with Teams Phone, and if you're looking at shared calling, right, this might be an opportunity to reduce the number of telephone numbers you need in your environment, which could also lead to a reduction of costs. DIDs are relatively inexpensive, but we do run into areas where maybe DIDs in certain area codes or certain parts of the world are not readily available. And if you're operating in the United States, a lot of times if you are purchasing a DID, you may be purchasing additional dynamic emergency services. On top of that, there could be additional fees, right? Again, there are ways to save money with this solution, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. We did talk about the scalability, right? One shared calling policy can support, up to 10,000 users. And again, to me, the biggest benefit here is just the flexibility, right? It doesn't have to be everybody needs a DID. It doesn't have to be everyone on shared calling, right? You will find that in basically a lot of the customers that I work with, some users are highly dependent on a DID, others are not. So this is, kind of adding that flexibility to just, choose the right solution that fits your business requirements.
Right. And I know multiple customers that we work with, they geographically dispersed, right? And so, as you said, with the flexibility and the scalability, right, they may have an office in Florida that doesn't necessarily need, DIDs. And so they would be able to use shared calling to deploy that. I think it's awesome.
For sure. Okay, so how does it work? So taking a look at this diagram on the left, right, when we look at that inbound calling scenario, pick up your cell phone. Let's say it's Verizon or AT&T, right? I pick up my iPhone. I dial that shared number. In this case, it's 425-882-8080. I call that shared number, and I will essentially reach a dial by name auto attendant in Teams. And the prompt will say, please say the name of the person you'd like to reach. And if Duane is in that shared calling policy with Don and Jonathan, right? If I say Duane Friedlander, Teams will route my call over to Duane. From an outbound perspective, again, if we have Duane, Don, and Jonathan, all part of this shared calling policy, from an outbound perspective, they will essentially, all have the same outbound number, which is fine. And, the important piece is that we're leveraging a Teams resource account in the background for this. So we'll create a, Teams resource account, and we will attach that resource account. It's going to need a license, phone system, resource account license. We'll assign the phone number to it that is shared, and we will essentially attach that resource account to a shared calling policy. So it's pretty simple on how it works. It takes, the first time you do this, it might take you 30 minutes to kind of set up the policy piece of it. And we'll show you on the next screen kind of what, it might be the next screen or the screen after. We'll go through how this is set up. But once your policies are in place, you essentially just add the users to the policy and enterprise voice enable them, and the dial pad shows up for them. So if you want to flip ahead, Duane, to the next screen.
Yep.
So how does this show up in the PSTN usage reports? The main piece here highlighted in yellow, right? It's really the call type. We will see in this case, this example is direct routing shared out. So we'll show a slightly different call type out just so we can differentiate. If we want to see what kind of call volume is happening in our tenant via shared calling, we can see that in the PSTN usage report. But it's important to show that it does show up as the same user, in this case, Peter. So we can go in and see, typical call analytics from Peter. So if you want to go ahead, Duane, we'll kind of keep pushing through here. Emergency calling. The main piece here is that when we do create a shared calling policy, we attach a number of emergency callback numbers. So there is a little bit of a sizing exercise that needs to happen when you're planning your deployment here. But essentially, let's say shared calling user 2 on the left places an outbound call for 911. It's basically going to, go into the shared calling policy, allocate a dynamic emergency calling number or callback number for that 911 call. So in the event, if the person making the emergency call is disconnected from the PSAP, PSAP would call back on that number. It will be held for 60 minutes. And then that call is connected back to the caller. So again, the team service kind of picks up and connects that call back.
So what happens if we've exhausted all of the DIDs that we dedicated for emergency callback?
It's a great question, Duane. So if all the numbers are allocated, Teams is smart enough to essentially reuse one of the existing numbers. So emergency calls will not fail, but it does get a little more complex, right? Because, we do want to try to, allocate enough emergency calls, callback numbers for our shared calling policy to account for like peak 911 call utilization. So that could vary by organization. Good question.
Awesome.
So yeah, if you want to jump ahead, how to enable. So we essentially start by creating a resource account of the flavor auto attendant, not a call queue typically. We assign a phone number to that resource account and an online voice routing policy if we're using direct routing, right? If this is a calling plan setup or operator connect, right? There could be some variance in this configuration, but this example is with direct routing. We will create the shared calling policy and assign emergency callback numbers. Today, this is done via Teams PowerShell. This will be supported in the Teams Admin Center in the near future. Then we create that auto attendant for the inbound calls, and we do enable dial by name to basically hand that call off to the appropriate user. And then we do like to scope the directory, because by default, when you create an auto attendant in Teams, it's going to want to leverage the full Teams directory. So we do like to scope this down as a best practice to make sure that only the folks in the shared calling policy are discoverable through the dial by name, unless you have some other business requirement there. And then we do create an outbound caller ID policy to make sure that we are masking outbound calls from these users with that shared calling number. From a user perspective, they do need the Teams phone license, and we do need to enterprise voice enable them. Then the last piece is just assigning the shared calling policy as well as the caller ID policy.
I was going to ask about scoping the auto attendant, so you hit on that one already.
Yep. For sure. So like I said, today this is all done through PowerShell, at least the shared calling policy setup. There's not a whole lot of parameters here that we need to worry about, but we can assign multiple emergency numbers. We do assign the resource account. We give it a description and a name, and that's really all there is to it.
Okay. And a few of the considerations.
Yeah, so if you're trying to think, right, ask yourself, is this the right, feature for my organization? Some of the common questions that you might ask yourself, right? Does everyone need a DID, or do you have a subset of users that may not require a DID? If they do not require a DID or frequently use one, right, shared calling might be the perfect thing for them. I mean, in my role, right, I deal with Teams phone every day, but most of my customers that I work with do not call me on my phone number. We schedule a Teams meeting, right? We have internal and external calling. Occasionally, I'm going to call one of my vendors. So for me, it's a perfect fit. And there's a lot of knowledge workers that may have similar calling needs. How many emergency callback numbers do I need per policy? That can vary pretty greatly, right? Part of it is just looking at, can you pull usage reports on your call volume today? And then also, how many users am I putting in, right? If I'm putting in 100 users in a shared calling policy, maybe one emergency callback number for every 10 users is a good ratio, right? If I'm using 10,000 users in a policy, I'm probably going to want a few more numbers. But again, the simplification here, this really helps you reduce the number of phone numbers that you may need to enable Teams phone for your user base. How many calling policies do I need? This can also vary, right? Part of this may depend on what is your inbound experience, right? So if we have offices in Germany, the United States, and Belgium, right, we might want to provide a local shared calling number in each of those regions to provide that local customer calling experience, right? So there's a number of ways that, you might consider carving up your environment from a shared calling perspective. And then looking at the inbound perspective, right? Do you even want inbound calling enabled, right? We're going to show on another slide here, and I know we're kind of coming up on the top of the hour here real quick, so maybe we'll move ahead, Duane, but let's look at like some of the, I think we have use cases here next, right? So yeah, let's look at this use case, for example. This is, in my opinion, is the perfect use case where maybe we don't even want inbound calling, but we want to enable, 200 conference rooms with shared calling. These conference rooms, right, from a PSTN calling perspective, we want to enable outbound, right? There are still users in many organizations that may go into a conference room and need to dial into a third-party bridge occasionally. So this allows us to enable shared calling for 200, Teams rooms, and they don't even want inbound, right? There's a lot of organizations that don't even want inbound calling into their conference rooms because it can be disruptive. So from a simplification perspective, right, we have 200 conference rooms, we have one DID shared by all conference rooms. We maybe allocate a bunch of dynamic emergency calling numbers, but still not all 200. So we have, in this case, 10 for every 20 conference rooms. And, look at the cost savings, right? We're basically using one calling plan versus 200, and we're managing 11 DIDs versus 200. So simplified cost savings, this can help achieve both of that.
Right. And I want to get to this one, Matt, because I think this one is important as well.
Yeah.
So
E911 cost savings, right? As I kind of mentioned earlier in this presentation, E911 services, there's a lot of carriers that do charge extra for that. And we have seen organizations, right, that have an investment in E5. They're looking at rolling out to, many users. And then once they start evaluating, well, who needs a DID? Who needs E911? All of a sudden, right, there may be kind of a cost there that they were not ready for, depending on what legacy platform they're coming from. However, again, they've invested in E5. So our goal is to help the customer realize the value of that E5 license investment, including Teams Phone. In this case, we can enable all of those users for outbound, but with a simplified model and reducing the costs again. So depending on your carrier, there's a number of things at play, but our main point here today is make sure, for one, you're aware of this feature. It is, still relatively new. And I think, based on the conversations that I have with my customers, right, different organizations are trying to figure out, hey, is this right for us? Is it not? And hopefully, our conversation here today has hopefully provided you some insight to this feature. In our last use case here, right, large scale environment, substantial E5 investment, turn it on like Teams meetings, right? It is kind of a bullish approach, but if you're leveraging Teams meetings today, enterprise-wide, right, you don't always need to have that marathon phone migration project that can take years, right? So think about this a little bit differently, turn it on for everyone, then ask your users or your business leaders, right? Who really needs a Teams phone number, a DID, right? And if they do, create, an intake process through your help desk to, gather that information and do weekly or monthly batches. It doesn't have to be hard, but again, this is a big concept here that I know most people have been working in telephony for many years, right? This is kind of a big stretch, but it's very reasonable, right? This doesn't have to be that hard.
right. And it back to the ease of deployment, right? We've all done phone conversions, and it's not a month-long process, right? It's multi-year generally, right? So this would enable an ease of deployment that we haven't seen in the phone business in a long time. So.
All right. I know we're kind of right at the top here.